2, check. Check 1, 2, 1, 2, check. Check 1, 2, 1, 2. Check 1, 2, 1, 2. Check. Check. Check 1, 2, 1, 2. Check 1, 2, 1, 2. Check 1, 2. Check. Check 1, 2, 1, 2. Check 1, 2.
Okay, good evening. Welcome to the 34th year. We're going to start out this evening with a blessing from Sheena Fortner. She's a second-year law student at Vermont Law. She worked on the Keystone case with Rosebud Lakota.
Hi, good evening. My name is Sheena Fortner, and my family is from Appalachia. First and foremost, I'd like to say thank you and Wopilak to each and every one of you from the doorway in to the doorway out. I'd also like to apologize to the elders in here for speaking before you. This is something that I was asked to do, so I will do it to my best. Tankasha Wakantakan Miniwichoni Petawakan Unchinamaka. Father Sky, Grandmother Earth, bless each and everyone in here, Tankashla. Watch out over each of us, Tankashla, our families. Protect us, Tankashla, that we can walk in unity together, Tankashla. Those on the front line who are standing up, those communities, the Indigenous communities, Tankashla, who are being affected, watch out over them, protect them, take care of them. Bless each and every panelist that's here, Tankashla, that we may come forward and speak from our hearts. That we may stand together in unity, Tankashla. That we may forgive those transgressions against the earth, Tankashla. That we will have peace together. Matakoyoasin, to all my relatives, my relations.
Thank you for that beautiful blessing. Good evening to everybody, and welcome to the 34th Annual Public Interest Environmental Law Conference here in Eugene, Oregon. My name is Alyssa Bonini, and I'm joined on stage tonight by my fellow co-directors, Emily Pajarizadeh, Annie Montgomery, and Emily Fenster. The fifth and invaluable member of our team, Isak Bruskin, is unable to be here with us tonight, but he sends his regards, and he's looking forward to getting to know you over the course of the weekend. Since the founding conference in 1983, this entirely student-run event has evolved from an intimate gathering of 75 participants into the premier environmental law conference of its kind, involving 12 keynote speakers, over 130 panels, and 3,000 participants. Each year, students plan and facilitate the conference as a forum for the discussion of timely environmental issues and their corresponding legal and political strategies from a broad range of perspectives. True to this legacy, we invite attendees to welcome new information with open ears and to engage one another in the constructive dialogue that is essential to the progress we all hope to make in this movement. Indeed, the open transfer of knowledge and of information is what makes PIELC so special. For some, PIELC provides a chance for old friends and colleagues to reconnect with fellow environmental advocates from all over the world. For others, It provides an opportunity to share cutting-edge research and developments in environmental activism, law, and policy. Some attend PIELC in a frantic push to complete their CLE credits for their respective state bars. For us students, PIELC is a vital reminder of why we chose to attend law school in the first place. No matter what brought you to PIELC this year, we hope that you leave us on Sunday with the renewed energy and motivation to become the advocates that you aspire to be. That, in itself, is a legacy worth leaving.
Thank you, Alyssa. Welcome to Eugene. If this is your home, hi neighbor. If you traveled here from afar, we welcome you. My name is Emily Hajarizadeh, and I'm a second-year law student at the University of Oregon. I've been asked by my fellow co-directors this evening to touch on the theme of this year's conference. For decades, the Public Interest Environmental Law Conference has cultivated a forum recognized for novel and constructive debate. It is a place to address both the best and the worst moments of humanity's relationship with nature and with itself. We have reflected on past interactions. We have fought to challenge matters on ecological, social, and cultural degradation. We have responded. Over time, PIELC has become a reliable element to the mechanism of modern environmental justice. Now, it is a time to build new legacies. Now it is a time to recognize that although the tools of rationality and logic have gotten us to where we have so much further to go. While we live in a world that expresses diverse realities, dominant assumptions of ecology, economy, and society have left us with only one narrative. A different construction of our assumptions will lead to a more open of shaping environmental justice in the 21st century. A legacy worth leaving, our theme this year, is a response to the drastic need of daily direct actions of individuals in their communities. Cohesive leadership models must acknowledge that individual participation directs society's impact on interdependent community and global systems. Diversity of cultures, talents, and specialties must converge to guide community initiatives in a balanced system. Each of us has a unique role that can no longer be hindered by the complacent, passive participation models of traditional leadership schemes. Building community means being community. This year at PIELC, we will be exploring alternative methods of approaching current ecological, social, and cultural paradigms. First, by examining the past. Let us not relive our mistakes. Then, by focusing on the present. Days to months, months to years, years to a lifetime. Small acts compound to the life story of a person, a place, a planet. What legacy are you leaving? Thank you.
Thank you, Emily. My name is Emily as well. I'm a second-year law student at the University of Oregon School of Law. And as my colleague just explained, our theme this year is a legacy worth leaving. In my mind, there's no better theme to showcase what we hope that you take from the conference this year. In my mind, a legacy worth leaving is about inspiring individuals to be catalysts for environmental change. There are a number of issues today plaguing our environment that are too vast to even contemplate. We hear words on the daily about pollution, global warming, climate change, ocean acidification, and so on. These problems seem daunting, and that's because we live in an era where 18 million acres of forest are lost every year, and some people predict that at current rates of deforestation, we could lose our rainforests in 100 years. Waters of the Pacific Ocean have heated 15 times faster in the last 6 decades than in the last 10 millennia. And many agree that we are in the middle of the 6th mass extinction, where biodiversity and ecosystems across the world is disappearing. As sad as this is the reality. We live in an era where 80,000 acres of rainforest are lost every day, where 100 million sharks lose their lives every year, many of which only so that their fins can become soup. We also live in a day and age where the horn of a rhino is more valuable by weight than gold, diamonds, or cocaine on the black market. Many of us hear things like this and don't know how to react. For me, it is a huge privilege to be among all of you, to be among so many talented environmentalists, advocates, lawyers, and community members talking about these issues. I am proud to be playing a part in hosting a forum where we can help facilitate discussions that will not only happen this weekend, but in the future because of connections that are made at this year's PIELC conference. And I'm truly honored to be a part of this. Aside from being a privilege to be up here on stage and here with all of you, a leadership role in this conference reminds me of why I came to law school. In my mind, there is so much left worth saving and so much more good that can be done. It breaks my heart to think that some people think that there's nothing left worth fighting for. We hear about tigers that are on the brink of extinction, but in reality, there are still more than 3,000 in the wild that need our help. We hear about the ivory trade and how it's threatening elephants in Africa, but there are still 500,000 that we could help save. We also hear about rhino numbers plummeting, but across Asia and Africa, there are still 29,000 in the wild that deserve our help so that they do not end up with their horns in the black market. In my mind, these issues have been caused largely by humanity. And so to me, this means that we here in this room have a role to do everything we can to help prevent these environmental travesties from continuing. This summer, I had the privilege of working with illegal, unregulated, unreported fishing in Cape Town, South Africa. While I was in South Africa, I saw a 3-month-old rhino calf. When I saw this calf, I was filled with two emotions. On one hand, I was scared. I was afraid that this innocent creature who's done nothing to deserve the fate that humanity has dealt her would end up with her fate as so many others of her species at the hand of a poacher's bullet. However, I was also filled with happiness and a belief that she might be able to beat the odds, either by her own luck, her own stamina, or by our help, and live a full, healthy life as a successful female white rhino. I'll never know if she makes it to adulthood, but what I do know is that I came to law school to help ensure that animals like her and our environment do not go down without a fight. I'm personally asking all of you to agree for yourself, your family, your friends, for the people in this room, and for those beings and people across our country and our world, to not sit back and watch while our environment is exploited for the benefit of a few. My hope is that this year's PIELC conference not only inspires each and every one of you to do what you can on a daily basis, but to ensure that all of you are able to use your individual talents to help leave a legacy that you are proud of.
Thank you, Emily, for reminding us what we need to fight for. My name is Annie Montgomery. I'm a second-year law student here. And this year I was really privileged to be a part of such an awesome group of girls and music. CCDs this year, we had, as a CCDs every year is always different and it's always interesting. And we had a lot of balls thrown in the air at us and we caught them, I think, every time and worked through difficult situations together. We learned a lot about ourselves and a lot about each other in this leadership role. There is a lot worth fighting for, and a lot of you in this room have been fighting for a long time, and a lot of you are just starting to fight. The sacrifices that we make as individuals to participate in the environmental movement are daily. They're not just felt by us, they're felt by our families, they're felt by people that love us in our lives that don't get time with us because we're maybe working late at night on a project that we think is the most important thing that's ever happened. There's a lot of sacrifice and a lot of loss in our lives to do this. A woman this morning, Berta Kaka's 100 environmental and human rights activists, was murdered in her home. I wanted to take a moment of silence to remember her. She was very outspoken about the hydroelectric project. Last year she won the Goldman Environmental Prize, and she was murdered this morning for her outspokenness for human rights, and so let's just take a moment of silence to remember her. So we want to thank her and everyone else that's lost their life and lost time away from their families and their loved ones to do this. This process that we had this year is always exciting, and thank you all for trusting us to do this. The isolation that you can feel when you really care passionately about something and no one else around you understands is part of why PIELC is so important, because when you're with people that are as passionate as you and care as much as you, you're reminded why you do this. You're reminded why you wake up at 4 in the morning and want to add one last line to a speech, or why you want to add one last line to a memo, or why you want to go out to a protest the next day. So remember, during this conference, when we're all together and our passion is inflamed and we're working through an issue, to direct that fight where it's deserved and not at each other. There's a lot of difference of opinions here. There's a lot that we all think that, a lot of different ways we think we can do things. But remember who deserves your anger and who deserves your passion and who deserves your kindness and who deserves a moment of understanding for their part in the process of learning where they fit into the environmental movement. We all have different roles to play, and honoring each other for their different roles is very important over the course of this weekend. This year, for a lot of us, most of our role was facilitating this conference. It was reserving rooms, it was answering emails, it was answering phone calls, it was staying up late with sticky notes, moving panels around. So as we go through this process of the weekend, we're so honored, we're so grateful for all of you to come here, because everyone here in this room is really who provides the content. We just make sure that it all runs as smoothly as possible. This evening, I would like to introduce one of the co-directors for the Native American Law Students Association, Megan Sigmana-Topic, to introduce our first keynoter. Thank you.
As Annie said, my English name is Megan. My Inuit name is Sihavana. I have the incredible honor of introducing our first keynoter, Dr. Dalee Dorough. Dr. Dorough is Inuit from Alaska and holds a Ph.D. from the University of British Columbia Faculty of Law in 2002, and a Master's of Arts in Law and Diplomacy from the Fletcher School of Tufts University. She is currently an Associate Professor of Political Science at the University of Alaska, Anchorage, and is an Alaska member of the International Law Association's Committee on Implementation of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, serving as an expert member of the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues for 2 consecutive 3-year terms. Do the math on that one. I'm not very good at that. But she currently held the position of chairperson for the 2014 to 2015 year. She is also a member and chairperson of the UN Board of Trustees on the UN Voluntary Fund for Indigenous Peoples. Obviously, Dr. Dorough has a very long history of direct involvement in the discussion, debate, and negotiation on the rights of Indigenous people, particularly on the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. She was an active participant in this work from 1985 up to the adoption of this by the UN General Assembly in 2007. She has a very long list of accomplishments, which we could probably talk about all night, and she has certainly been an incredible inspiration in my own life, in my pursuit to not only attend law school, but to stick through it and not drop out, which I've thought about many times. But her work has motivated me to keep going. And when this conference theme was first announced, the legacy worth leaving, Dalee was certainly one of the first people that came to my mind as someone who has been creating a legacy that my generation can continue carrying forward. And I just want to say a huge thank you to Dalee for everything that you do and that you're here tonight. So it's my pleasure to welcome her up here for her keynote.
PME, how is everyone? Good. First of all, I'd like to express my gratitude to both Annie and also Stefana for this generous invitation to introduce Indigenous human rights as they've developed within the United Nations, and also introduce some of the issues facing Arctic Indigenous peoples specifically throughout this presentation. And I think that the theme, a legacy worth leaving, for this 34th annual conference, the PIELC conference, is quite significant from an Indigenous perspective because of the views and perspectives of Indigenous peoples in terms of their own legacy, not for just the next generation, but as many of you know, the next 7 generations, at least for many Indigenous peoples across the globe. So I'm just very pleased to have been invited. I should note that I've been invited in the past, but the dates and activities always conflicted with other commitments that I had, especially at the international level. As Stefana has indicated, I've been engaged in the work at the international level, and that's what I would like to introduce to you throughout this presentation. As you can note from my opening slide, there is a sense of urgency about the issues facing Indigenous peoples. And I know from at least the brief discussions that I had with a number of law students earlier today on campus, and some of the work that they're engaged in, they too know that there is a sense of urgency facing Indigenous peoples, not only in the United States and North America generally, but across the globe. I think we all know who is and who isn't an Indigenous person or the concept of Indigenous peoples. However, at the international level, within the United Nations, there is no term, there has been no resolution adopted defining Indigenous peoples. There is, however, a working definition that has some important criteria. Some of you might know the reasons as to why there is no formal official definition. There's the potential for including those who are not legitimately Indigenous or excluding those who are legitimately Indigenous peoples or persons. This language that you see on the screen, and I'll ask you just to read through it quickly, is a working definition, and it was the view of Indigenous peoples that no actual definition should be adopted or officially or formally adopted by the United Nations for a range of reasons, namely the 2 that I've just now enunciated. What I think is significant about the definition and the criteria shown in this working definition is, of course, the historical trauma experienced by Indigenous peoples in every region of the globe. This is an important dimension, I think, in terms of who we understand to be Indigenous peoples. The other significant element of this definition is this psychological pull, this desire to maintain your identity, to continue to be who you are as an Indigenous person, and your attachment to a collectivity, a distinct community. And I think those, from my point of view, very important dynamics and elements of this working definition. Not to mention the dynamic of the legacy that present-day generation of Indigenous peoples want to leave for the next generation. And so the capturing the desire and being determined to preserve, develop, and carry forward your values, practices, institutions, and customs for future generations. This is a highly important element of Indigenous communities. I just want to say a few things about the nature of human rights, because it's important, it's an important undercurrent to this whole discussion. And I know it's kind of funny to be doing this at a law school, but I think it's still useful to remind ourselves about the important nature of human rights. Universal, everyone, every human being. Interrelated, interdependent, indivisible, and interconnected. And from an Indigenous perspective, this is very natural, that everything is interdependent, interrelated. Everyone in this room, in terms of your civil and political rights, your economic, social, and cultural rights, you can easily see the linkages and the interdependent nature of your human rights. And what happens when one is being violated impacts many of the other rights that you hold as human beings. They're inalienable. They can't be destroyed or extinguished. And I use this term extinguished because in the context of Indigenous peoples, more often than not, they have been pressured. In fact, they're the only peoples in the world who have been pressured to have their rights extinguished. We could get into a whole discussion about that kind of racism, but that's another lecture. This is quite different from the fact that often governments and others violate rights, but the point is that they are inalienable. They can't be destroyed, they can't be extinguished, but again, it's a whole nother matter when they are grossly violated by a government or by others. Another feature of human rights is that there are no rights that are absolute. There are always competing rights and interests. There's always a constant tension. And clearly, throughout the history of Indigenous peoples, throughout the Western Hemisphere, as well as elsewhere in the world, we've experienced these constant tensions and competing rights and interests. And for the most part, really the bottom line in terms of the developments of Indigenous human rights within the United Nations system and elsewhere, both the International Labor Organization, the Organization of American States, it has been recognized that the existing regime of human rights within the United Nations had not been responsive to Indigenous peoples and their distinct cultural context. And in order to fill that gap, the United Nations was responsive. And again, in a nutshell, that really has been the overarching objective of the work of Indigenous peoples within the United Nations and other intergovernmental fora, is to express their views about the content of their human rights and to tell their stories from their perspectives in order to shape human rights that are actually responsive to their characteristics and their reality. I should make note of the fact that throughout all of this work, we're not talking about creating new rights in terms of international human rights and international human rights law, but moreover, being responsive to the distinct cultural characteristics and context of Indigenous peoples. I'm going to go over some history here because of the limited time. If we had a whole semester, I could drill into some of these events more intimately, but for now, in the earliest days of the League of Nations, Indigenous political leaders brought their concerns to the international community in an effort to gain some justice. The first being Descahe, and some of you may know of this history already, an Iroquois faithkeeper, a leader of his people in the Iroquois Confederacy, the Haudenosaunee, traveled to Geneva, Switzerland, tried to pry open the doors of the League of Nations, really on the basis of violations of their treaty rights and what they understood to be the political relationship between themselves and others. In addition, a Maori chief, Ratana, also traveled to the League of Nations, again, in the context of the violations of rights they understood were affirmed in the Treaty of Waitangi. So there's a long history of engagement of Indigenous peoples. I want to point out that the International Labor Organization, in the context of Indigenous peoples being exploited by employers, by companies, by corporations, the ILO became engaged in the work of drafting conventions and recommendations responsive to safeguarding the rights of Indigenous peoples as individual employees, kind of like OSHA, for example, as well as the forced slavery and other conditions that many Indigenous peoples in those early days were experiencing. So it's quite significant that the International Labor Organization was responsive at a very early time. They did so on the basis of individual rights and treating them solely as employees, not necessarily responsive to the fact that they had the political right to self-determination, that they had rights to lands, territories, and resources, that they had harvesting rights or traditional economies and so forth. But nevertheless, they took an interest and expressed some concern by adopting a range of different recommendations in particular, but significantly in 1957, they adopted Convention number 107, Convention on Indigenous and Tribal Peoples, and did attempt at that very early, at least in my lifetime anyway, early effort to safeguard the rights of Indigenous peoples. But within the United Nations, there were a number of different international human rights experts associated with the human rights regime at the Center for Human Rights in Geneva, which is the home of the Center for Human Rights within the UN system, that were becoming more and more aware of what was taking place and rights being violated against Indigenous peoples, especially throughout the Americas. And of course, in the background, you have quite a lot of political organizing, especially in the United States. Many of you are probably familiar with the American Indian movement and other efforts of Indian tribes to maintain their cultural integrity and their distinct identity. These human rights experts associated with the existing regime within the United Nations saw that there was indeed a gap within the UN's constellation of international human rights instruments. And they chose to pay some attention to this huge gap within the system. And fortunately, they were able to convince the then Subcommission on Prevention of Discrimination and Protection of Minorities to initiate discussion about adopting a resolution to appoint a special rapporteur, Jose Martinez-Cobo, to begin a voluminous study on the status and conditions of Indigenous peoples worldwide. I can't imagine a single person undertaking this task, but he attempted to, but he had to call upon the help of Augusto Williamson Diaz, who really should be credited with the writing of this important and voluminous study. He was a Guatemalan who recently passed away, but left an extraordinary legacy in terms of the content of the study that he prepared. Before Augusto Williamson Diaz finished the study, he made an important recommendation to the subcommission, which gained some traction. His recommendation was that a working group on Indigenous peoples should be established with a twofold mandate of annually reviewing the status and conditions of Indigenous peoples across the world, number one, but number two, more importantly, to begin the drafting of a declaration on the rights of Indigenous peoples, which would take the form of, for example, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which attaches to every single one of you as human beings. So the idea was that the UN, through a resolution, would in fact establish a working group on Indigenous populations, and I'll get into that a little bit later, was the term that was used at the time. So a resolution was adopted, creating the working group on Indigenous populations with this twofold mandate. And in 1982, they began their work in earnest. And at the time, there were very, very few Indigenous peoples engaged in international human rights work. And so the early annual meetings of the working group really only attracted 100 or so Indigenous peoples representatives. If you take into account that there are 370 million Indigenous peoples across the globe, obviously their participation was insufficient. Nevertheless, it did create a forum, an opportunity for those Indigenous representatives that participated in these annual meetings to begin telling their story, that historical trauma, colonialism, subjugation, domination, exploitation, dispossession of lands, etc., to these independent human rights experts who really were had very limited knowledge about Indigenous peoples. So it was an important, in my view, fora for storytelling from the Indigenous perspective and to inform these 5 independent human rights experts about the content of the human rights of Indigenous peoples. At the time, there was also concern about the existing ILO Convention number 107, that Indigenous peoples became aware of the potential within the International Labor Organization to revise that convention and bring it up to date. 1957, very assimilationist objectives that were underlying ILO Convention 107, the notion that Indigenous individuals should be happy to have a job and to be safeguarded by the ILO. This was old news and quite regressive from the perspective of Indigenous peoples who began actively and aggressively criticizing the International Labor Organization, which then triggered a 2-year revision process of ILO Convention 107, which ultimately emerged as a new convention in 1989, Convention number 169 on Indigenous and Tribal Peoples. This is the only existing international legally binding treaty specifically concerning the rights of Indigenous peoples, at least for those countries that have ratified the instrument. Presently, there are only 22 countries around the world that have ratified ILO Convention number 169. From the Arctic, I think it's important that Norway and Denmark, and the fact that Greenland is within the realm of Denmark, it's quite significant that those 2 member states of the ILO have ratified ILO Convention number 169. Throughout these, there was incredible development of the drafting of the declaration. By this time, the annual sessions of the working group attracted over 1,500, close to 2,000 Indigenous representatives, including many from Africa and Asia, other parts of the world that had not previously participated in the work to draft the declaration. But even more significantly, the working group, again, heavily influenced by Indigenous peoples and their storytelling, not to mention the fact that this international fora at the United Nations was very open and democratic, meaning that anyone in this room that was concerned as an academic or a representative of a non-governmental organization or an Indigenous person themselves could have attended these annual sessions and gave interventions about the drafting of the declaration, could have influenced the dialogue and discussion, and drafting was actually taking place, and the declaration was beginning to take some important shape. They concluded their work, the working group concluded their work and sent it to their parent body, the subcommission, who had faith and confidence in the 5 experts that they had appointed and rubber stamped it and sent it on to the Commission on Human Rights. This is where things got really interesting, because it was no longer an open and democratic fora. It was a forum controlled by governments, the then members of the Commission on Human Rights. And Indigenous peoples, there were only a few non-governmental organizations that had gained ECOSOC status or consultative status from the United Nations, and so it was quite limited in terms of the rules of procedure and who could access the Commission on Human Rights sessions. Fortunately, the United States government, who was heavily lobbied by Indian tribes throughout the United States, proposed a resolution that would allow the Commission on Human Rights to open its doors to any Indigenous peoples organization or tribal government that wanted to participate, with one caveat, that the respective country had to approve of the application. A bit problematic, and certainly something that Indigenous peoples, including myself, fought. However, adopted by consensus that this resolution would then allow Indigenous peoples representatives in the doors of the Commission. And the only occasions where a government did not approve of an application, it was limited to only 2 incidents, namely Taiwan and Indigenous peoples, self-identified Indigenous peoples from Taiwan. The Chinese government would have absolutely nothing to do with that. The other incident, I can't remember exactly the terms of it, but nevertheless, the United States government to this day is very proud to have been the authors and the carriers of this important resolution that opened up the doors of the Commission on Human Rights. But even more significantly, the Commission on Human Rights then set up an intersessional working group to review the draft declaration, and it became a war between Indigenous peoples and member states of the United Nations over the content. By the time it was transferred to the Commission, the draft declaration contained 19 preambular paragraphs and 45 operative articles. It was drafted and written like a legally binding convention. For example, it set out the right of Indigenous peoples to lands, territories, and resources, and the corresponding responsibility of state governments to create mechanisms to satisfy and affirm rights of Indigenous peoples to lands, territories, and resources. So governments found quite a number of the articles indigestible. Imagine India, the government of India, sitting at the table, looking at language that affirms the right of Indigenous peoples to self-determination. Or African states, or any range of, even the United States had trouble with what was then Article 3 of the draft declaration, affirming that all Indigenous peoples have the right of self-determination. So it was a huge battle to safeguard the integrity of the text that, for all intents and purposes, Indigenous peoples had drafted throughout the working group sessions. A range of different things happened throughout this period of time, but and I'll get to them in a bit. But most significantly, the Commission on Human Rights, in the context of reform of the United Nations, largely led by the lobby of the United States, that the UN was wasteful, duplicated efforts, etc. Some of you probably remember that whole agenda of the United States government to reform the UN. Out of it came some important reforms, namely that the Commission on Human Rights was terminated in favor of the new Human Rights Council, which was elevated in order to report directly to the General Assembly. They instituted the Universal Periodic Review, wherein every country, every member state of the United Nations human rights record has to come under Universal Periodic Review. Also, the need for member states to campaign for membership within the Human Rights Council. And these were really important developments that were the outcome of some of that reform. The very first chairperson of the Human Rights Council was one of the most brilliant ambassadors I've ever seen in action, Luis Alfonso de Alba of Mexico. And we can get into a discussion about rights ritualism and governments ratifying international human rights instruments and then letting them sit on the shelf and collect dust. But nevertheless, this fellow was shrewd. He was elected as the chairperson of the Human Rights Council. It's the first session. He looked across the room and recognized that they had the numbers to pass the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples at the first session of the new Human Rights Council, and descended on with a recommendation to the General Assembly that they ought to adopt this thing. Usually things are adopted in the United Nations by consensus. And that's a whole other problem in terms of procedural rules, but I won't get into that. However, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and the United States still had problems with how the right of self-determination was articulated, how rights to lands, territories, and resources were articulated, and they wanted to go with this. During the Human Rights Council session, they called for a vote. The US called for a vote. The vote was taken, the results were in, they all had the numbers, and it was adopted, along with a resolution recommending to the General Assembly that they ought to adopt the declaration as well. So I kind of think, I don't ever have to go back to Geneva again. This is good news. Ship it off to New York, the headquarters, the United Nations General Assembly. They get their hands on it. The Kansas group, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and the United States undertook some pretty nefarious acts. And we have actual evidence of the acts that they took. And that was to incite fear amongst those governments who didn't have sustained and consistent participation in the drafting of the declaration by telling them that if you allow this declaration to be adopted, the sky will fall. India will no longer exist. You'll be torn into how many states in terms of recognizing the right of self-determination of all indigenous and tribal peoples in India. China had a bit of a different problem in terms of the definition of who is indigenous and who is not indigenous, as you might imagine. The Kansas group still again had problems with how the right of self-determination was enunciated. Hence their problem with the term peoples and the use of the term populations in the early days. Nevertheless, indigenous peoples were able to effectively argue that the declaration was not a threat, and we had to do everything we could in terms of damage control and to meet one-on-one with state members from Africa, from Asia, and elsewhere. In the end of the day, it was adopted by the General Assembly, unfortunately by a vote. If it had been adopted by consensus, I think there would be some discussion right now about turning it into a convention, like the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which started out as a Declaration on the Rights of the Child, and it was adopted by consensus and then later morphed into a convention. But because it was adopted by a vote, I think we have some serious hurdles, and I'll mention some concerns about that. 144 in favor, 4 against, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and the United States, and 11 abstentions. And significantly, the Russian Federation abstained, Colombia abstained, and a number of other governments have abstained. But the good news is, since 2007, those 4 that voted against the Kansas group have all now, as governments, publicly pronounced their support for the UN Declaration. And in my view, and I think in the view of many other indigenous human rights advocates, this instrument, this international human rights law instrument, now has universal consensus. Of course, nobody's going to go to Putin and give him a swift kick in the shins about their abstention and just leave that sleeping dog lie, basically. But it is quite significant that 144 nation states are now actually the 4 in favor, as well as a number of the 11 member states that abstained have now pronounced their support as well. again, in the background, we had ILO Convention number 169. When the UN Declaration was adopted, some discussion and dialogue took place within the International Labor Organization. They now regard these two instruments, the legally binding convention, at least for those who ratified it, and the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, to be mutually reinforcing, and that the whole array of Indigenous peoples' individual and collective rights in terms of economic, social, cultural, civil, and political rights have now been addressed by the international system. And the concerns that the ILO had at the outset in Convention 169 did relate to the right of self-determination and the view that they didn't have the competence to deal with the political rights of Indigenous peoples. So if one opens up that convention today, they'll see what many refer to as a qualifier about the use of the term peoples. That's now history. And many of the institutions that have been created within the United Nations have easily adopted the term peoples with an S, and I'll get to that in just a second. So the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples is now out there as a pivotal international human rights instrument. Governments in 2014 in a high-level plenary session of the General Assembly reaffirmed their support for the UN Declaration and made some important commitments to begin the implementation of the UN Declaration, and also pointed to or provided some directives to the UN itself to begin the implementation of the UN Declaration. And this is highly significant because at that time, those 11 abstentions didn't oppose the resolution and the outcome document that emerged from this high-level plenary meeting. And so you could pose the question, well, does that really then mean all 193 member states of the UN support the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples? Again, I wouldn't be too aggressive about the questioning on that point, but it is quite significant. A range of very important articles were affirmed in the UN Declaration, but I want you to remember, again, that human rights are interrelated, interdependent, indivisible, and interconnected. Obviously, the right of self-determination is Article 3 in the UN Declaration, and it borrows from the international covenants, the 1966 covenants, the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, and the International Covenant on Rights. Fortunately, all of the U.S. citizens in this room, the U.S. government ratified the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights in 1992. They were put in place in 1966. I think they just had to really think carefully about whether or not they should ratify it. But Article 1, Paragraph 1, all peoples have the right of self-determination. It doesn't say all peoples except Indigenous peoples have the right of self-determination. And frankly, that's the way Indigenous peoples won the day on the right of self-determination and its explicit affirmation in the UN Declaration. I include the second paragraph because of its reference to subsistence. In no case may a people be deprived of its own means of subsistence. This is pretty firm and sweeping language. I mean, think about, especially in relation to environmental law, think about how many peoples may have been deprived of their own means of subsistence because of degradation of the environment, etc. I mean, you could probably conjure up all kinds of realities that people are living today, or scenarios and future scenarios. But again, this is quite significant language. It's quite significant in the context of Alaska Native people, because in 1971, 5 years after affirming this international human rights standard, the United States government purportedly extinguished Aboriginal right to hunting and fishing. This is a problem. This is a huge problem. So that's the standard in 1966. Article 3 of the UN Declaration, all Indigenous peoples have the right of self-determination. By virtue of that right, we freely determine our own political status and should be able to freely pursue our economic, social, and cultural development. In fact, those few words really say it all. Why do you need 46 other articles to enunciate what it is that Indigenous peoples aspire to? This language, I think, is very important in terms of what I just raised as far as subsistence is concerned. Now, of course, we argued for something much stronger, like article or paragraph 2 of Article 1 of the Twin Covenants, but that didn't fly. In part, it's acceptable because we know that many Indigenous peoples have been deprived of their own means of subsistence, and there needs to be recourse, there needs to be remedy, there needs to be reparation. We need to recreate that integrity in terms of traditional economies. Article 25, there are several different articles within the Declaration that affirm the rights of Indigenous peoples to lands, territories, and resources. And on that note, I urge everybody to type in the UN Declaration on Google or any browser and read the whole of the Declaration. But I have just taken Article 25 because of the elements, especially in regard to future generations. I mean, if you think about the legacy worth leaving, the right to maintain and strengthen this profound relationship that Indigenous peoples have to their environment and to uphold those responsibilities for future generations. Article 26 affirms the right of Indigenous peoples to lands, territories, and resources that they've traditionally owned, occupied, or otherwise used or acquired. That's sweeping language that recognizes the past, the present, and the future. Article 29, in terms of the issues concerning the environment, this is a significant article as well in terms of the productive capacity of their lands, territories, and resources. And it also provides, again, a good example of setting out what the right is and also the state responsibility to be responsive to ensure that Indigenous peoples can exercise and enjoy the right. I want to point out that all of the work that was undertaken at the United Nations and the International Labor Organization triggered some important developments in other intergovernmental fora. Some of you are probably working with and familiar with the UN Guiding Principle Rights. If you look at what's taking place within the World Bank and the impact that they can potentially have, especially in developing countries that are seeking to put infrastructure in place, and the impact that they could potentially have on Indigenous and tribal peoples, they've adopted an operational directive that's responsive to Indigenous concerns. However, major footnote, it's not enough. It's very inadequate, and they're actually now reviewing their operational directive, and it's hard to know what is actually going to emerge in that context. And I think, unfortunately, it's kind of going sideways for Indigenous peoples. The recent adoption of the Sustainable Development Goals, Indigenous peoples attempted to have some input there and to influence those Sustainable Development Goals. For example, trying to put in place a way to disaggregate data in terms of Indigenous peoples and ensuring that they're identifiable as to whether or not the world community, all of us, but more significantly member states across the globe, are going to achieve those sustainable development goals within indigenous communities. I mentioned the Organization of American States earlier. They are considering a proposed American Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples within the OAS system. So everybody within the Western Hemisphere, Indigenous peoples in the Western Hemisphere, will have a regional instrument. In addition, a range of different General Assembly resolutions have been adopted, establishing some important activities specific to Indigenous peoples. It's highly significant that important jurisprudence continues to emerge from the UN Declaration. And in fact, it is extraordinary that even when the draft declaration was in place, as a draft, the human rights treaty bodies associated with all of the existing human rights instruments were beginning to take into consideration Indigenous human rights complaints and invoking the declaration in its draft form. And this is just extraordinary in terms of the goodwill and responsiveness of the individual human rights experts that serve on these treaty bodies when they're dealing with an international human rights instrument that's written within an individual framework, an individual rights framework, to creatively and innovatively make the argument that Indigenous people's rights, not only individual Indigenous persons, but Indigenous peoples as communities or collectivities, that their rights can in fact be safeguarded through the existing treaty body regime. I'd like to point out, for those interested in this area, the International Law Association has put out expert commentary. It's the first international legal interpretation of the content of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. They have now completed their work, and their reports can be found on the ILA website. Furthermore, they've put in place a second committee on the implementation of the UN Declaration itself. And they're doing this by way of case studies so they can drill into how countries and Indigenous peoples are actually implementing the standards affirmed in the Declaration. Quickly, the other events that were triggered throughout all of this work, within the United Nations at least, in 1985, a voluntary trust fund was put in place. It used to be the Voluntary Trust Fund for Indigenous Populations. Fortunately, by resolution of the Human Rights Council, they changed it to Indigenous peoples. Voluntary donations by anyone, but namely member states, are made, and they re-grant to Indigenous peoples who want to become engaged in the work at the United Nations concerning Indigenous peoples, including the drafting of shadow reports to the reports that member states are required to deliver to treaty bodies if they ratified an international human rights treaty, to attend the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, to become engaged in the UN. In 2001, the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues was established. This is a very unique special mandate within the UN. The forum is comprised of 16 individual experts that are to serve in their independent capacity. 8 of them are elected by member states of the UN, and 8 are nominated by Indigenous peoples organizations on the basis of geopolitical regions across the globe. And they serve in equity, and they serve Indigenous peoples across the world. They are not to carry their own government's water, especially on the part of those that are elected by member states. And they report to the Economic and Social Council, so it's quite a high body within the United Nations, and it does a range of very significant things. But the main point of their work is to saturate the whole of the UN system with Indigenous perspectives, meaning that all the agencies and the specialized agencies of the United Nations How are they being responsive to Indigenous peoples? How are they implementing the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples? In addition, the Human Rights Council, the former Commission on Human Rights originally, created the Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. The first Special Rapporteur was Rodolfo Stavenhagen, a Mexican national. He was succeeded by James Anaya, professor of law at University of Arizona College of Law, the author of Indigenous Peoples in International Law. Both of them served 2 3-year terms as the Special Rapporteur, and the present Special Rapporteur is Vicky Talicopos from the Philippines, an Igorot Indigenous woman. I should say that James Anaya is also an Indigenous person. The thrust of their mandate is to look at specific human rights violations through country visits and to issue special thematic reports and so forth. In addition, the Human Rights Council created a body of 5 Indigenous experts that serve the Human Rights Council as an advisory body. This was established in, as I say, 2007. It's referred to as MRIP, the Expert Mechanism on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So it's fairly clear that all of this work has triggered important developments to ensure that Indigenous peoples are a permanent part of the agenda within the United Nations. As far as current objectives are concerned, and I'm just speaking in very general terms, as far as the Indigenous world is concerned, or the Indigenous movement is concerned, is the absolute need to implement the standards in the UN Declaration. Also, significantly, to safeguard those standards. And this is a very alarming trend that has emerged. And it has to do with, okay, we adopted the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. In 2014, we reaffirmed our support for it through the outcome document. But you know what? If we're over here at UNESCO, nobody's really watching what we're doing. You know, we could reinterpret and rewrite these standards. The Convention on Biological Diversity. And you know, there aren't enough Indigenous peoples out there to cover all these different activities, or those that have the resources and the ammunition to ensure that within the Convention on Biological Diversity, that they're not writing provisions about access and benefit sharing and capitalizing on Indigenous knowledge in a way that's only favorable to the pharmaceuticals. I mean, this is just one example of, you know, if you're not there keeping an eye on what states are doing or other more powerful interests like pharmaceuticals are doing, you've got a huge problem. And so an important objective is to make sure that state governments are being watched and they're not actively devaluing the status of the declaration or diminishing the standards. And more often than not, they are actually doing that. As far as the next session of the Permanent Forum, it'll take place in May, and anyone that is interested in attending can register through the Secretariat of the Permanent Forum and go as an observer or an active participant. All the information is on the Permanent Forum's website. Significantly, the theme that myself and my colleagues on the forum adopted for this session is Indigenous Peoples, Conflict, Peace, and Resolution. Governments had a real problem with us choosing this as a theme, and many lobbied against it, but the decision is up to the 16 members of the Permanent Forum, and there was a total consensus, even including from our representative, who's a Russian national, as well as an Iranian national that served on the Permanent Forum. So it'll be interesting to see what types of issues emerge in terms of this particular theme. Myself and my colleague Ed John, hereditary chief from British Columbia, who was nominated by the North American region to the Permanent Forum. We co-authored a study specifically on this alarming trend of how states exploit weak procedural rules that ultimately end up generating weak substantive language and text within various different intergovernmental fora, and we'll introduce that study at the next session of the forum. I quickly want to turn to Arctic Indigenous peoples. How much time do I have, Mike? 15 minutes. Okay. Okay, all right, I can do that. A circumpolar view of the world. And the reason why I pull up this map, and I actually should have credited where I got it from the Nakavik Corporation, Inuit organization developed this map. The Inuit homelands stem from Russian Far East throughout Alaska, Canada, and Greenland. And the work that I've done at the international level has been on behalf of the Inuit Circumpolar Council, an international non-governmental organization representing the Inuit. We organized in June of 1977 in Barrow, Alaska, as a result of the incredible foresight of the person recognized as the founder of the Inuit Circumpolar Conference of the ICC, the late Evan Hobson, who was Inupiaq from Barrow. He was also the first mayor of the North Slope Borough, the largest municipality in the United States, if not in the world, which basically is everything north of the Brooks Range. He, prior to organizing the ICC, he made a run for our congressional seat against Don Young, who's actually still there. Or unfortunately, is still there, I should say. But Hobson's platform when he ran against Don Young in 1976 was the need for an Arctic policy and the need for Indigenous peoples from the Arctic to have a seat at the table. In his opening speech to the ICC, he uttered some very important words. And I think that his words at that time, again, is extraordinary foresight and an important development in terms of recognizing that Inuit as a family, as direct blood relatives, should unite in order to ensure that they had, again, a seat at the table. This quote, "Our language contains the intricate knowledge of the ice that we have seen no others demonstrate." That still holds true. It speaks volumes about intellectual property, relationship to the environment, integrity of the culture, in my opinion, many things. At the time, of course, this need for a balance between especially oil and gas development and the Arctic, because we knew that on the horizon, everyone was going to rush to the Arctic. And this is the phenomenon that we see today. It's now pretty vogue to be doing something about the Arctic. But again, as far as the work and the foresight of Hobson to organize and unite the Inuit in order to have influence, in my view, was quite exceptional. And many of the issues that he was speaking about remain outstanding and still present a challenge to the Inuit throughout the circumpolar region. The ICC did yield to and respond to his dream of putting in place a comprehensive Arctic policy. Inuit leaders from across the circumpolar world did draft and agree upon and adopt a comprehensive Arctic policy, again, long before anybody else, including the rest of the United States, was even concerned about the Arctic. These are the different chapters of the the comprehensive Arctic policy, and they remain important guiding principles and standards. In fact, myself, I used many of them to try to influence the declaration work. For example, if you look back in the 1980s at an earlier draft of UN declaration, there was reference to sea ice, but because sea ice isn't universal, it didn't remain in the text. Nevertheless, coastal areas and oceans do appear in the UN declaration, but it was really by virtue of the comprehensive Arctic policy principles. Obviously, now we're faced with some very serious environmental threats and the impacts of climate change. A number of reports have been prepared by the ICC. One in particular, for those that are interested, especially with regard to Arctic shipping, is a report called Sea Ice Never Stops. And it catalogs in a very short, readable document all of the impacts that have been triggered by climate change that are eventually going to lead to increased Arctic shipping throughout the Circumpolar region, not least of which is militarization within the Arctic region, as well as impacts upon marine mammals and their habitat, which of course, because everything is interdependent and indivisible, interconnected and interrelated, will have impacts upon Inuit and their way of life and their traditional harvesting economies. We continue, as far as stewardship is concerned, we want to ensure our food security, our cultural security, and environmental security of this unique region in the world. And Inuit have invoked the rights enunciated and affirmed in the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Some of you may be aware of the human rights complaint that was pursued by our former chairperson, international chairperson, Sheila Watt-Cloutier, within the Organization of American States, about the linkage between the US government's emissions as contributors to rapid changes and climate change specifically. She knew that there was some difficulty with the causal linkage between the argument and the conditions that are facing Inuit Arctic communities, but she utilized it moreover as a way to put the human face on the adverse impacts of climate change. And I think this was an important strategy. The outcome of the human rights complaint wasn't what had been hoped for originally. She was quarterbacked by James Anaya in particular. It's important for us to think about how the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples can come to life. How is it that we as a society, how is it that governments, how is it that Indigenous peoples breathe life into these human rights standards so that Indigenous peoples, not only in the Arctic, but across the globe, can in fact enjoy their rights and exercise their rights? I want to say that this instrument, it's an important tool. It's not the solution. Obviously, as far as, and I can give you numerous examples about how states are trying to devalue the declaration. But what I want to say is that in addition to strategies that individuals take at the local level, at the regional level, at the national level, there are international strategies that can be undertaken on the basis of invoking the standards affirmed in the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And it's my hope that ultimately more Indigenous peoples take hold of this declaration and again begin to breathe life into the standards affirmed therein and make them a reality. And I think for myself as an Inuk, I think the easiest way to put it is that we simply want to ensure that there will always be Indigenous peoples on Earth. It's that simple. We have a right to the past, we have a right to the present, and we have the right to a future. And that's what's significant about the Declaration. Bienvenue.
All right, I want to thank Dr. Dorough for that wonderful presentation on the international status of Indigenous peoples and her work with the UN on these issues. I know that we're kind of in a transition right now, so I'm going to do this slowly. But I have the express pleasure of introducing our next keynoter this evening, Mr. Peter Neill. Peter Neill is the founder and director of the World Ocean Observatory, the W2O, an online forum for information and educational exchange of the world ocean. Tonight, Peter will be presenting themes captured in his new book, The Once and Future Ocean, Notes Towards a New Hydraulic Society. Following his keynote, Peter will be holding a book signing in the EMU foyer. So please stop by after the keynote and pick up your copy of The Once and Future Ocean, as well as engage with Mr. Neill about the topics that will be presented in this evening's address. Neill's keynote will be devoted to analyzing and transforming our relationship with the world's most promising and imperiled natural element, the ocean, and the interconnected cycles of water, which are essential for all aspects of human survival in the 21st century. Neill provides persuasive arguments for why the ocean matters and how its sustainability and careful use, from mountaintop to abyssal plain, can establish a new paradigm for value and social behavior around which society may build a new post-industrial, post-consumption, global community. This fundamental shift is directed toward the creation of a new hydraulic society, wherein water in all its cycles and conveyances will determine how we live, from our buildings and cities to the structures of governance through which society may succeed in facing challenges of an increasingly populated world. This fundamental shift, Neill calls for a new ocean ethos and offers concrete examples of technologies and applications that already exist but have been suppressed by complacency and political subversion, often financed by exhausted vested interests. Neill's presentation on the once and future ocean will offer a bold vision for a practical and possible future based on a revolutionary paradigm shift that can be implemented through the political will of thousands of citizens of the ocean who understand the necessity for change, the logic of new moral alternatives, and the reality of the consequences if we fail to act in time. Without further ado, Mr. Peter Neill.
Can't you just tell I'm from back east? He's wearing a necktie, for God's sake. But in my community, a necktie is a sign of respect. And I wear it tonight because of the reality of speaking before a group of people who are already deep in the trenches, dealing with environmental issues across the full spectrum of the challenges that we face, and are here to collectively share their wisdom and to build for a future agenda. So when I come up here with the presumptive statement that my goal tonight is to change the way you see the world, please understand that my respect for what you have done and what we can all do together is by no means diluted. So if we begin to look, take the long view and look at the Earth from space, you can conclude perhaps that we named it wrong. We should not really call it Terra. It should be called Aqua. That blue marble, 70% of the surface of the Earth covered by water, water essentially infused in every aspect of our being, whether it's natural resources or whether it's a system that is political, financial, social, and otherwise. It's in our bodies, it's in the food we eat, it's in the things we make and consume. Water, in fact, is pervasive in everything we do. So, we won't spend too much time on talking about why the ocean matters. But if we begin at the horizon and we look out and we stand and maybe we see a distant smoke of a passing freighter, we see nothing. And in fact, we often just assume that it's a kind of endless separating medium that can be constantly abused, that it in fact can assimilate all kinds of abuse. And we treat it with that kind of ignorance and indifference all the time. My argument is, however, that it's the ocean that connects us. It's not the ocean that separates the continents and separates the people. It's absolutely the opposite. It's from the day that the first sailors left their shores in search of something other, with no real knowledge, that began a process of globalization which exists to this day and which is the process of exchange of goods and people and ideas. And so when you begin to see that the ocean as that kind of plane, as that place where that kind of exchange has taken place over all time, you begin to see it differently. And you begin to give it a kind of understanding and significance that perhaps is not all completely shared. So we are a maritime nation. We are a maritime world. And we must be able to move forward with that basic assumption in hand. The ocean affects our climate. We know that. It has for all time. Before anybody ever talked about climate change, the ocean is involved in essentially all of the weather systems and patterns that go around the world, and all of the ancillary and inclusive phenomena, natural phenomena that interact in this sort of atmosphere that surrounds our entire globe. Fresh water, of course, is only 3% of the water on Earth, and 2% of that 3% is locked in the poles. So when we talk about fresh water, we're really only talking about 1% of the water, and that's what 7 billion people are subsisting on right now. So when you think about that, and you think about how we waste water and how our water habits, freshwater habits, manifest themselves these days, you begin to understand that there's a serious problem here, and that we need to start thinking about and understanding the relationship, say, between freshwater and saltwater. Astonishingly, the World Water Forum, which is the sort of global forum on water issues, freshwater issues, draws the line at the salt line. You can go to their conferences, and there'll be 200 or 300 academic papers, and the word ocean is not even mentioned. So when you begin to understand that there are these kinds of false, arbitrary divisions and perspectives that exist in the world, and those things are not only bad science, but they're just bad policy. Food, 40% of the protein on Earth today is generated by the ocean. That's going to have to happen and increase over time, and particularly as we need to feed several billion more people. And when we begin to understand that the land itself is exhausted. We have taken and consumed the productivity of the land. We've been able to create all kinds of tools, fertilizers, etc., that have been able to increase that productivity to a certain point. But we begin to understand that there are desperate consequences associated with that. And in fact, as we begin to poison the land, as we begin to overpopulate the land, as we begin to see the effect of climate change on the land, we begin to understand that the food aspects, the food potential of the ocean is enormous. Health. We talk a lot about ocean acidification. It's a huge problem, probably the most significant problem affecting the ocean. And one of the great manifestations of this is the bleaching of the coral reefs, and that's, there's a lot of kind of concern about that in terms of tourism and the dive industry and all the rest of it. But the real problem there is that that's the pharmacopoeia. We've exhausted the microbes of land. We're using whatever we're doing with them now essentially to mitigate the effects of drugs that have been already generated. And when you start to look at what is happening in the future, you begin to see, for example, in trials on cancer, about 50% of them right now are derived, the drugs are derived from marine organisms. So there's a huge pharmacopoeia there, an enormous potential that has absolutely everything to do with human health, especially as we get more and more populated and we are threatened by diseases that we don't already know. Energy, security. I'll do security first. If you have a climate situation, if you have drought, if you have artisanal farmers that suddenly cannot essentially feed themselves, if you then have a resultant kind of community of political instability, if you then have opportunistic interventions, whether they be ideological or otherwise, and then you have refugees who begin to leave those places to go to other places and disrupt those places, what you have basically is a water security problem. And you can, and people have argued that the Middle East situation is a very good example of that. You have the diversion of the Jordan River between Israel and Palestine. You have the path of ISIS, which is followed from the western or the eastern slopes of the Turkish mountains down to the Arabian Sea. Follow the Tigris and the Euphrates. Follow the roads which are based on the ancient trade routes which went from water place to water place. And when that water supply is disrupted, then you have a political situation that becomes untenable. Energy. Yes, we heard earlier someone say something about there's wave energy, and there's wind energy, and there's solar energy, and there's mechanical energy that can be derived from the ocean. But in my view, the most important thing about the ocean is that it's the biggest heat pump ever. The geothermal potential of the ocean is enormous, and we have done absolutely nothing to begin to understand how we can make that work. We have some minor attempts that have been subverted over time, but the fact is that the geothermal potential of the ocean as a way to generate energy to drive all kinds of things that we'll need in the future is there for the taking. And finally, finance. All of this is interconnected, and it's interconnected just not in the form of natural connections, circles in science, cycles of conveyance, but it also has its financial interconnections. And those are real, and we cannot just simply dismiss them. We cannot just say, well, they're all bad. The fact is that the world is an integrated place financially now, and in order for us all to survive, we need to understand that and adapt to it. So what I'm asking for, basically, is a value shift. Let's just look at the 19th century and 20th century paradigm. For lack of a better place to start, we'll start with the Industrial Revolution. We go back further, but the fact is that over the last 100, 150 years, we have essentially created a system of unlimited growth based on consumption and driven by fossil fuels. That's the paradigm. And there have been enormous benefits derived from that. There's no question about that. You just simply can't deny that costs of living, quality of life, all of these things in many, many places have gotten better. But we have now reached a point where the negative consequences overwhelm the benefits. And that's what we are faced with today. And we're faced with it in ways that are uncontroversial. We now understand that the impact of offshore drilling, or the impact of fracking, or the impact of moving oil and its byproducts around, all of the consequences of that have begun to have such enormous negative impacts on how we live and where we live that we have to realize that the age of oil is over. That 19th century paradigm is done. And by the way, the market is telling us we are going to go through a very difficult period, very painful period of transition. We already have thousands of people in the oil sector being laid off. We have an estimated 400 or 500 bankruptcies of oil companies. We have fracking wells and other wells that can't produce because there is no market. Now, some of us can gloat about that, and some of us can say that's a good thing. I think it's an inevitable thing, but it's a very painful thing. Those people who will not have their houses, will not have their jobs, they could be us. And we shouldn't just dismiss them because somehow they've been tainted by the oil business. The fact is that we all bought into the system. There's not a person in this room who didn't buy into the system one way or another, no matter how you feel now and no matter what you're doing now. You're part of the problem. We are all in this together. So we need to solve it together. We can't abandon our neighbors. We can't abandon their rights to life. And we need to be able to collectively come together and to understand that there needs to be a new paradigm. And we have to understand that it's now. We have to understand that that paradigm must be adopted immediately. So my new premise is that we enter into a phase of managed growth based on sustainability and enabled by water. And by water, I mean all of the water cycle. I mean the ocean, the atmosphere, the mountaintop, the descent through the watershed and the aquifers, back to the coast and again, plus all of the cycles of conveyance that circulate water and protein and all the rest of it around the earth, and all of the cycles of upwelling and downfalling that have to do with the health of the water column and those creatures that live there. This is what I mean by the ocean. And that interconnectivity is not new news. Indigenous peoples have taught this to us for years. But the fact is, it's too late for us to continue to, whatever indifference we may have, whatever misunderstandings we may have, if we don't understand the wisdom of the teachers, we better understand, make a wisdom of our own, and at least understand that we have to come together in some way, and my guess is that we will find many commonalities of value. So the new paradigm for the future ocean is this idea of a hydraulic society. And that passage from one place to another is a kind of rite of passage in the same way that we make a rite of passage from youth to adulthood. From being illiterate to being literate, to hearing the first music and making it. These are all things that are part of the rite of passage, and they are creative activities. And that creativity is what is called for now. So hydraulic society is simply basing our new life around the movement of water, which is the most precious element on Earth. We can live without diamonds. We can live without gold. We can live without uranium. We can live without chocolate. Coffee? How about coffee? Live without coffee? Oh, yeah, because but we can't live without water. 2-3 days, we die. Our family dies. Our community dies. Our associations die. Our institutions die. Our nation states die. That's the truth. I have a story about a reality show proposal I was involved with, and we took a family of 5 from northern New Jersey, put them in a room and gave them the UN daily allotment for basic water needs to meet their cooking and hygiene, etc. And the idea was that we'd have 11 episodes. Well, we never got past the pilot because this family fell apart. They couldn't live together. The children went berserk. They couldn't take 45-minute showers. The dad couldn't stand the fact he couldn't wash the car. There was no irrigation for the golf course. The pool was empty. And they literally could not live together within a few days. A few days was all it took. Now think about that when you think about all the people around the world who don't have adequate water already. Think about the good people down there in California who have now had to cut their water ration by 20% in just 18 months because they didn't want to do it, but they had to do it. And it became immediately clear to government and the citizens and the producers that they were going to have to change their ways. So what we're getting to, however, is this point where there is no denying what needs to be done. So we want to talk about exemplary beginnings. We want to talk about invention. We want to talk about what are the processes that we can engage in, the activities that we can engage in that would begin to make the necessary changes. So I'll give you a few examples. They're obvious in some ways, but I just came back from Peru, and I got to Machu Picchu. Carried all this water bag all the way up, and what you realized there was this civilization was based on water management. It was astonishing to see that built into the architecture was an entire realizable, understood system of collection, distribution, recycling, and all the rest of it. And that allowed them to live, subsist in a way that lasted for a very, very long time until they either were attacked from outside or they got too large and they couldn't essentially continue to base their civilization on adequate supply, and they collapsed quickly. There's theories about the Aztec civilizations. There's the city of Theta-Priscipri in India, where you can go and understand that they had the same thing. They had all these water collections. They had all these water collection systems and systems and recycling, all gravity fed, that essentially was able to support a city of 200,000 or 300,000 people. Today, maybe 15,000, 20,000 people live in that town, and they don't have enough water. So we have to start to understand that in order to address this problem, we need to start thinking about water as this essential resource, and we need to plan around it. So there's some ideas. Here's an architectural idea. Take a high-rise building and turn the entire building into a water collection system. So lots of water lots of rainwater in Portland, Oregon. In Oregon, you suddenly are collecting that water and you're using that water in every way possible. So you're using the gravity decline of the water to essentially generate electricity. They're either coatings in the pipes or little propellers that essentially they make them all mini generators. You have in the building integrated utilities. So you have people living, people working, people recreating, people having gardens. You have all of these things that are essentially built into the same system that becomes self-recycling, self-cycling. The idea is that you collect it when you can get it, you store it, you augment it if you need it, but if you don't need it, you keep using it over and over and over again, and you create a building that is essentially water neutral. Nothing goes to waste. So this is not so stupid. I mean, the city of Portland, Oregon is generating electricity, water going through their pipes that are specially coated. The exterior of those buildings could be essentially created the same way, could be treated the same way. So as water slides down the outside of the building, it could be generating electricity, it could be diverted into collection systems, generating electricity, et cetera, and then recycling all the way around. It's not, the engineering is not the problem. It's the understanding that we have to use that engineering. So if you look at the Nile River, 800,000 acres in the watershed, something like that, maybe more than that, I'm not quite sure what the number is. It's enormous, 4 or 5 countries. And this Nile River watershed group hired the Danish Hydrological Institute. These are water hydro engineers. And they came in and they did an enormous analysis of the entire river watershed. They essentially documented every aspect, where the water was, how the water moved, what was the seasonal impact, where were the demands, where were the future demands, what would happen under certain climate changes, conditions. And they projected these things forward and provided this planning document that essentially has created a structure of organization for government and intergovernmental cooperation that will allow for this system to actually support the people that live there. This is not difficult to do, actually, except that you need to have understand, you need to have the will and the intelligence to understand that this is a way that we're going to have to use to go forward. There's a terrible article I read, it's in the book, I hate it. It's a memo within by a man named Merrill Lynch, reporting to his confrere in the Bank of America about water as an asset class, water as a commodity. And believe me, the smart money is already there. We already have Coke and Pepsi making more profit out of water than they make out of soda. We already have people who have water technology investment portfolios, where they're investing in water treatment, filters, pumps, all of the associated mechanical systems are out there. But these things represent a huge opportunity for jobs, new technologies, new opportunities for people who used to be maybe in the oil business, but now can come over and work in another place. I mean, there is a whole legitimate net of activities that's associated with this. The danger, though, of a privatization of water, of course, is anathema. And there is a universal water rights document that essentially guarantees that every person on Earth gets 40 liters of water a day, something like that. And after that, you build into how water is used the real cost. What does it actually cost? If it takes 150 gallons of water to make a cup of coffee, we should pay for it. If it takes 1 million gallons of water to build a Volkswagen Jetta, we should pay for it. When I walk down a supermarket aisle, I hear nothing but cascading water. It's the processing, water, not in the price. It's in the packaging, water, not in the price. And all of the byproducts of all of that packaging and all of that processing simply disappears, goes back into the system. It may or may not be corrupted, but it's gone for a long time. And we just assume that at the other end, at the head of the pipe, at the mouth of the river, there will be more. And so you now have situations where we have water at the mouth of the river, and then we have all our sort of economic deals that have been made along the way. And when you finally get to the deals that are made between the United States and Mexico for water to irrigate tomatoes, there's no water. There's no water left because it's all been sold and consumed before it even gets to the last people in line. So the whole idea of essentially understanding that the connectivity of water from upstream to downstream has implications in it with regard to, let's say, the governance. If, for example, I'm a small town at the head of the river and I want to build a paper plant, jobs, taxes, good people of the town all come together, they cut the deal, and in comes the plant. Out of the plant goes all the waste. And no one cares about what happens downstream. Nobody cares about the town 10 miles down the river. Nobody cares about the coastal fisheries and wetlands. Nobody cares about any of that because we got what we want. Well, if you can't do that because you're obligated to essentially put the water back in as clean as you found it, or essentially have a process that doesn't corrupt it in the first place, that changes how governance works. So watershed associations suddenly become a very different kind of way of looking at things. We have watershed associations all over the country, but they're marginal. They actually are usually they're sort of well-meaning planners and environmentalists who are trying to figure out how to essentially protect the watershed areas and all the rest of it, but they're not actually taken that seriously. But they actually represent, I think, a whole new future form of how we govern each other and how we essentially work together to assure that those resources are available to us now and in the future. I mentioned virtual water. Virtual water is basically externalities. It's all of the water that you don't hear or see, but it's the water used to build all the things that we have and want. And when that price structure comes back into play, suddenly things will fall out and this will be too expensive to have because it is neither that utilitarian and it's too expensive. And we don't need to consume it because it's priced accordingly. So the economics begin to change as soon as you start making these changes in your perspective. And you can actually measure your own mark, your own watermark. There's a site, watermarks, on the web, and you can go in and put in all your parameters. You can lay out all your water consumption. How many times you wash your car, how long you take showers, all this sort of thing. What's it cost? And you can actually come out with a kind of water index for yourself and your family. And you can begin to see where the water that you use where your habit could change. And you could begin to change that consumption pattern in such a way that, well, does it really make that much difference? Of course it does. It makes a difference in your life, but then when it's added to the impact on you and you and you and you and you, and suddenly millions of people have changed that habitual habit, we have done it. Government has had nothing to do with it. We have taken that power for ourselves. And we claim, a government that's built on the people and the people's will. And so the people's will doesn't necessarily always have to have a lawyer to enforce it. We can do it ourselves. Plastic bags. Plastic bags is a perfect example. Nobody legislated against plastic bags until people in local neighborhoods and supermarkets went and said, look what it's doing to the beaches, look what it's doing to the fisheries, look what it's doing to the seals and turtles. We don't want this to happen in our town. We want to do something about it. My little supermarket had a vote, a cashier's vote. Check out, you got to vote. What do you think about that? Here are 3 ways to deal with plastic bags. And we voted a system. And these are just simple people, 1,000 people in a small town. And we changed the way that it happens. So if you bring your own cloth bag that you use over and over again, you get a credit. If you don't bring a bag and you want a plastic bag, You pay extra. And it was fascinating to watch. The guy who owns the supermarket says, "You can't believe how fast this changed." We're only talking about pennies. But pennies matter to people. And those pennies were suddenly enough for somebody to say, well, if I bring my own cloth bag, I don't have to pay, and by the time I finish, I've saved $20 a month on the penalties for using this thing. And now Chicago, Los Angeles, Portland, I don't know, New York City, no plastic bags. If we, and why? Why is this so great? It's because, and why didn't it happen before? Because guess what plastic is? Plastic is oil. And the oil companies didn't want to have that. The plastic companies didn't want to have that. They wanted to keep making plastic bags and plastic bags and plastic bags. And we're all worried about the plastic that's all floating all over the ocean. And yet we control the source. We can change that behavior overnight. So sell your plastic bag stock if you haven't already done so. Should have sold your oil stocks, by the way, a long time ago. I have to say that I'm a little bit amused by the divestment situation around universities. That I've had some insight into the investment policies of certain universities where they resisted the divestment situation. You sort of wonder why. And you realize that there's this weird little competition that happens to go along between money managers that operate endowments in college and universities. And there's a big deal about whether you got a 12% return or a 12.6% return. And the colleges actually really care about this. This is actually more important to them than the food. The colleges that go around and say, well, gee, we got the best food. Well, the students may appear, but that's not what the trustees are interested in. That's a return on investment. So they find some very elaborate justification for not doing it, not divesting, and guess what? In the last year, how much value has been lost in those endowments because they didn't settle those stocks? And it's because they weren't thinking. They were thinking complacently. They were not thinking with any sense of the future. They were not actually thinking even with the context of their own mission. So we have to start to begin to understand that these behaviors are pervasive. There's everywhere. Now, your guys are lawyers. My dad was a lawyer, and his father. And one day he asked me, well, what do you want to be a lawyer? When you grow up? I said, well, I don't think I want to be a lawyer. He said, good, you would be a very good one. And I said, well, wait a minute. I would have been a great prosecutor or a defense lawyer. Until I actually got into a case with a litigator, and I realized how hard those guys have to work. To be a litigator is to be so involved in detail. It's just appalling to me that people can actually do this work. So congratulations to all of you future litigators. Go out there and multiply because we need you. But I ain't there. And thank you, Dad. But the point is, I didn't know what to do. People keep saying, well, Peter, this won't happen. This is such a cock idea, so idealistic. I had a conversation just the other night with somebody who just couldn't do anything but tell me all the reasons why it wouldn't work. And one of the things she came back to was the laws are all written against you. I said, well, actually, no, really. Where is she? Where is our nature's trust? Is she in the room? I read that book right here, authored in the University of Oregon, and suddenly I realized that in Roman law, in English common law, and in American law, there is this thing that basically says that the natural resources of the land are owned by the people. They can be exploited and licensed, but only in the context of sustainability and their availability for future generations. So I'm all over this. And I'm all over Children's Trust. Is anybody here from the Children's Trust? God bless. God bless. These folk, I'm sure you all know about it because you're local, but where I come from, it's new news. But these folks are bringing cases in states and now in the federal court where essentially they're using that that doctrine as a way to challenge the laws and procedures that have been created that have essentially nibbled away at the prerogatives and many of the institutions like the EPA and the Clean Water Act and the Clean Air Act, all of these things which essentially have been nibbled at and accepted. Little languages and bits of languages that sort of takes parts of it away. And who are the plaintiffs? All the plaintiffs are children, 18 years old. The future generation are the plaintiffs in this case because, like Indigenous people, they understand that what we are doing is we are taking away, allowing these assets to be taken away from us and essentially exported. They don't go back into the system unless we have a way to make it so. And here's a legal foundation that allows it to happen. So hats off to the Children's Trust. So the new paradigm, hey, listen, if you've got a better one, come on up here. It's yours. But if you don't, then think about this one. Think about this idea, because it's not a function of not having the technology or not understanding the science, not even a question of not having the financial resources. We have those things. What we don't have is the political will, and we've allowed the political will to be essentially taken away from us, and we have essentially opted for complacency. Now, many of you in this room are organizers and activists, and that's the work that has to be done. But look how few of you there are. There's nowhere near enough of you. So here's an idea that might, through amplification and aggregation and talks like this and gossip amongst yourselves and enlisting your children, that might essentially create a new community of citizens of the ocean who understand this new paradigm and who will go out into the world and say, no, we're not going to do it that way anymore. Mom, I don't want to do it that way. You're wasting water. You know, Dad, forget the car. What's the car? Leave the car dirty. Let the rain wash the car. Forget the golf. Golf doesn't make any difference. It doesn't make any difference. There's another way to relax. There's another way that doesn't take up all this land and consume all this water. There are a million different ways that can happen in terms of is it a revolution or an evolution? Well, I'm calling it an evolution but it's a fast one. It's not a revolution, but it's a fast evolution, and it's driven by human will. It's driven by each and every one of us. We are each and every one of us an evolutionary. And it's up to us to get onto the barricades and to make that happen. We live in a collaborative age. We have the tools by which we can partner with each other. We can communicate with each other. We can essentially collaborate with strangers. We can talk to people all over the world. We can engage people in understanding our ideas and our behaviors and suggest to them that they might do the same, receive their ideas in exchange and bring those back into your community. So the whole idea of a collaborative age is all part and parcel of the values that are inherent in the paradigm. So Citizens of the Ocean is sort of my community. A little enterprise called the World Ocean Observatory. Have a look. You'll find their information as wide and deep and dynamic as the ocean itself. It's an amazing aggregation of information about the ocean, defined as an integrated global social system. And it has all these communications tools, syndicated radio, digital magazine, forums, massive social media, and there's 1.5 of us. 1.5 FTE, to use the human, whatever you call it, the Human Relations Department, FTE, full-time equivalents. That's who we are. And yet we're addressing one of the biggest aggregated bodies of data and information that is available. It grows every day, and we are communicating and using the responsible science to advocate for change. And you can spread that far and wide. You can go there, you can share there. And you can use that site and its tools as a way to begin to spread the word. So the 1.5 FTE can sit back on the East Coast in our neckties, and we can talk to millions of people around the world. We can message millions of people around the world. We translate these little audio segments into 7 languages. Swahili, Chinese, Portuguese, Spanish. The majority of people in the language spoken on Earth, our little thing, we define that audio which advocates for all these things with example of how these principles and who work and who's doing them and what are the exemplary organizations that are involved in, can be heard worldwide. It doesn't take $12 million. I say that our budget is the pizza budget of the World Wildlife Fund. What I'm talking about is in a time of trouble, a time of strife, a time of division, a time of pain. Water is the healer. We go to the beach, we go to the riverside, we listen to water in our gardens for the kind of empathetic response, the kind of connection, the kind of peace, tranquility, harmony that water provides for us. And it's what we need in our bodies to be healthy. It heals us. It sustains us. It's the most valuable thing that we can have on Earth, and we should organize ourselves around it. So read the poem. Has anybody read Laudato Si? Well, yeah, a few of you have. God bless. I read it. It's amazing. It's an amazing document. Has anybody read The Law of Mother Earth? Now the Law of Bolivia, soon to be the Law of Ecuador, which has language in it that is astonishing in terms of accepted legal principles about the disposition, ownership and disposition of natural resources. So it's out there. It's out there. Work has been done. There's more work to be done. You have people in religious communities, in indigenous communities, in progressive communities. We have people all over the world who understand this viscerally. And if you engage them and have them realize that they are part of a community and that we're all looking out for each other, then we have an opportunity to actually implement the paradigm and go forward. So I'm calling that the ocean ethos. It's not an ethic. An ethic is sort of a didactic law. You're either yes or no. It's either ethical or it's not ethical. Ethos is more flexible. Ethos is more inclusive. Ethos says we're all going to express this morality and this identification with nature in a different way. We may do it through a religious perspective or a cultural perspective or whatever it may be, but we're going to do it, and we're going to do it together. Now, when it comes to the end of the day, I did a radio interview this morning, and the woman said to me, Sacramento, California, she said, it'll never happen. Nobody will do this. Nobody's going to give up what they've got for something else. I said, well, you know what? Here's the difference. I get that. I understand that. People are telling you that and demonstrating that behavior all the time. We see it all around us. But there's a difference here. The difference here is that without water, we have no choice. The urgency is paramount. There is no complacency acceptable. You can choose to what? Collapse? Die? In the name of what? Chocolate? No, you can choose to essentially realize that the thing that you need the most is not only the element, but the idea that will help, will essentially allow us to survive. And I keep talking about this. People say it's a little shrill, Peter. You ought to kind of calm down a little bit, you know. Don't be quite so noisy. Don't move your hands quite so much, you know. Lower your voice. It's going to be okay. And I keep saying, no. I'm an advocate. Advocates don't vote. Add vote. They don't lower their voices. They raise their voices. That's what advocates do. And so no more calm, no more new age, no more mindfulness. You won't have any mind to mind if we don't deal with this issue, and we need to deal with it sooner or later. So think about the new paradigm. Think about your reaction to it. Think about how you can essentially contribute to the new hydraulic society. And let's all enter into the 21st century and make it. I got it. Make it a place that lives up to our own expectations. You know, we have these high expectations of ourselves. We call ourselves exceptional. Well, exceptional people do exceptional things. They don't deny. They don't leave it for somebody else. They don't take it so somebody else can't have it. They basically stand up and say, the exception here is a new behavior that is going to enable us to come together as a global community connected by the ocean and to move forward generation after generation. And if it's 2, I'm happy. If it's 7, hallelujah. Thank you. So if anyone wants to ask a question, do we have a little time, Emily? If anybody wants to ask me a question, I'd be happy to rant on. If not, meet you at the water fountain. Yes, ma'am.
Where do you suggest all the students and young people start this process? Where do you suggest that college students or young people start with this process?
What should college students do? Is that the question? Yeah, well, vote. How about that? I don't want to hear anything more about millennials sitting out. I don't care who you vote for. Well, I do. But I want you. I don't want you, because essential to this is that it's a collective action of individuals. So that's your greatest opportunity and privilege. On top of that, you can join any one of the organizations that are here and any one of the thousands of organizations that are available to you that's doing this kind of work. Thirdly, you can take a Citizens of the Ocean pledge. It's on the website. It's in the book. And you can make those simple modifications for your own behavior. And you don't have to brag about it, just do it. Just do it. And maybe you say, well, you know what, I do this, what do you think? Maybe you should do it. Let's do it. Mom, Dad, let's just change this. Why can't we change this? And so as individuals and as young people with energy and intelligence and education, you have nothing. You must be part of the ethos. If you aren't, we're in real trouble, because you're the ones that are going to suffer more than anybody else. And your children, Mademoiselle, your children are the ones that we're doing it for. That's what you do. Yes, sir.
Can you talk about animal agriculture and water?
Animal agriculture and water? Well, this is food country, so I have to be really careful here, not only about what I know and what I don't know, but we have patterns of consumption that are well established, which have associated water consumption built into them. And because we've had all the water we think we need, we've never really taken a good look at that. But if you're in China, for example, I can remember in China in the 70s looking at a field, and here comes this guy, and he's got a bucket. He's got 2 buckets, on a yoke. And he's been to the well, he's brought the buckets up, and he's coming, he's got a little place right here, he's got his field here, he's got all his plants in there, and he puts 48 buckets. He knows he has to put 48 buckets, and I watch it. I watch all 48 buckets go into this system. And this field is, the water just is slightly declined, the water just simply moves. Each one fills up, goes on, goes down, and after the 48th bucket, the last one is saturated. So I asked my companion who spoke Chinese, I said, does he put 48 buckets in every day? So no. Some days there are 52 bucket days, he knows. Sometimes there's a 28 bucket day, he knows. So it's if we learn how to observe and not assume, and we do it within the context of the value system that we're talking about, people will change and it will turn out to be to their advantage. So you have in agriculture, you have essentially people who have learned how to essentially change how we grow things. We just don't always have to have industrial agriculture. We don't always have to have fertilized fields. I mean, we have essentially fertilized so many fields along the path of the Mississippi River watershed that now, below the mouth, in the Gulf of Mexico, there's this huge area of eutrophication where nothing can live. Nothing can live. And, by the way, this seems to be a popular example I've been using lately, the Corps of Engineers. Everybody goes, ooh, this is the Corps of Engineers. The Corps of Engineers has a 3-part mission. You can think of the first one, it would be navigable waterways. You can think of the second one, probably flood control. What's the third? The third is environmental protection. Now, you have a generation of people in a system, by the way, which is trans-state governance. It's a system funded by the feds, run by a kind of military organization of engineers, right, that has authority to overlay behaviors on states within this enormous watershed, right? And so they've been filling flood control, they fill the marshes. Navigable waterways, they dredge the rivers. Environmental protection, they don't do. But what happens when all of the young people, the young engineers that are now learning environmental science or learning engineering with environmental perspectives, what happens when they get in the bureaucracy? What can they do from within that bureaucracy to change that system? It already exists. It's a massive watershed governance opportunity. But we dismiss it because we think we have a stereotype. There is a behavior that is demonstrated, but that doesn't mean it can't change. And it's structurally already organized to do exactly what we're talking about. So, animal watering, animal waste, fertilizer, what we feed the animals, all of those things are all part and parcel of the same problem. And I believe they would all change with those change behaviors. Anybody else? That's the answer, I'm afraid, but I can do, let me think about it, I'll do better. Anybody else? Way in the back, 2. Did you get it?
So there are many, from what I gather, there are many communities that have reclaimed sewage water and are using it in agricultural operations and other municipal uses as well. And you just wanted to ask Peter to speak to that, or as a water policy?
Personally, I think this is a system that is condemned in certain places like us with our sort of hygienic fetishes. There are health policy issues. There are chemical challenges and disease issues. On the other hand, I have no problem with this whatsoever. I have no problem. What we're doing, all we're doing is we're treating that water. We're treating sewage water anyway, and we're just dumping it in the ocean. And by the way, we're using systems that are supposed to be combined, integrated systems, right? Until you get halfway down the system and the sewage pipe and the storm drain pipes actually come together. So you got them come together. The town I lived in had this situation. They had the two pipes came together, sewage from here, storm drain from here. They commingled. They went back, separated again, down to the sewage plant. Half of the water that was the so-called storm drain water, now half sewage, goes out into the bay. The other half, which is supposed to be sewage, which is now half freshwater storm drains, with all the stuff goes into the treatment plant. So I said, well, that seems a little odd. Why wouldn't you just spend a little bit of money and close the gap? Oh, you can't do it. It costs too much money. And then I said, well, tell me about this. What happens to the volume of this water when it gets to the treatment plant? He said, well, we close the plant. The plant can only handle so much volume per day. So if we have a weather event, right, we just close the plant so we don't break the plant, and all the water goes into the bay. So now all the water is going in the bay. The sewage and the storm drain are all going in the bay. I said, well, how long does it take to recalibrate, sort of open up the plant again, getting it back running, and getting it recalibrated to its efficiency? So 3 to 5 days. How many events do you have? 100? So the plant is never working. The plant never was working. It was unbelievable. I said, do you actually, is this really true? You're joking, right? What you're really saying is that this sewage treatment plant is working at less than 50% efficiency all the time. You see that? Now you have situations where, well, in Maine, we have a town called Poland Spring. It's owned by Nestle. The taxpayers built the road, goes south down to Massachusetts. Every 15 minutes, 10,000 gallons of water comes out of that well, and disappears from the state. The royalty is negligible, and by the way, it's set by the company. The amount of water that's taken is also measured by the company. We have no one who stands there and says, oh, you reported that you took 5,000 gallons, but actually you took 7,000 gallons. No, that doesn't happen. So it just goes out. They are the biggest political contributor to the legislature in Maine. They are an enormous contributor to our notorious governor. And he wants to privatize all the water. Now, it's an interesting example because there are 3 or 4 towns around Poland Springs. Poland Springs is a very small town, and they are all part of the same aquifer. Their wells are running dry. So they're going to start to sue their municipality and sue the government in order to essentially protect their water rights, which are being stolen and exported at a subsidy provided by everybody else in the state. And then they all use plastic bottles. The city of Sao Paulo, Brazil, 12 million people. Suddenly there's no water, no fresh water. Why? Well, climate, extreme weather, deforestation, erosion, outdated plants, no maintenance, corruption. It's a series of activities that are all interrelated and comes to a point when suddenly the system is broken. And I take that as a metaphor, if you will. Take that as a metaphor that says, okay, let's think about that. Climate, extreme weather, deforestation, now different changes of the landscape. Cheap technology, cutting corners to maintain it, corruption in its operation, in its political supervision. And what you have is a process that could be actually described to cover many more things than just the town municipal water supply of Sao Paulo, Brazil. And it just all happened, nobody knew, and now suddenly they have to tank water into Sao Paulo in order for the people to essentially wash their hands, wash their clothes, cook their food. So it's not as if this is new news. And it's happening in many places. And it's happened in the US. I mean, Flint, Michigan. Just a tragedy when you think about it. Just such a tragedy. You know, you have a system that is essentially, it's working sort of. Some guy trying to please some guy to score some kind of ideological point or cut a few bucks from the operating budget makes an uninformed decision, which ends up now with a system that is corroded, old system of lead pipes, which is corroded, which now has lead in the children, has destroyed that community's, shut the system down, is going to have to be completely rebuilt at costs of hundreds of millions of dollars of taxpayers' dollars. Not only the town doesn't have anything, the state is going to have it. The governor's not going to be accountable. He's in charge, but he won't be held accountable. And us, we're going to pay for that. There's Obama put $80 million for it. To go to Flint to help the people deal with that. Real estate values are destroyed. Who's going to move there? Oh, by the way, the GM plant in Flint found that the water that was being used out of the Flint River was corroding the new parts on the assembly line. So the state found $200,000 or $300,000 to put the plant back on the old system off the water that was coming out of the Detroit treatment plants. And so GM, they went ahead with clean water. The people in the town, who happened to be heavily, majority poor, minority, people already under enormous stress, nobody gave a damn. They didn't even think about it. And when the people that didn't understand what was going said something about it, they were shouted down. They were told, leave it alone. Until it all falls apart. And use that again, it's a metaphor. You have a situation, you have changing circumstances, you have political ideologies, you have sequestered funds, you have all of these things that essentially build the case against the social service. And okay, you're going to cut this health program or that educational program. We all hate that just as much. But in this case, there's no water. And those people, and guess who's providing the water? Nestle. And I'm told by Michael Moore, so take it for that the governor's wife is a special political consultant to the Nestle company. Go figure. I mean, this is intolerable. It's intolerable. And it's just not the 200, 300, 400, 500 people in this room that need to know about it. It's many more people that need to know about it. And we need to provide them now alternatives. We need to be able to say, look, if you do it this way, this won't be able to happen. If you understand that these things we need to protect ourselves against corruption or protect ourselves against these sort of ideological invasions on common sense, then maybe we can protect our lives and we can protect our children's lives as we go forward. Anybody else?
Yeah.
Sir?
You remember what the people of Bolivia said, what their chant was during the Bechtel versus people?
Nothing.
No.
Well,
How were the people?
when they started,
Other than the people in power.
yeah, they just came in, Bechtel came in, changed the rates, did what they said they were gonna do, built up the plant. They were gonna provide the water at a certain rate, they came in and changed the rates. The people were, God bless them, Coach Obama, they sat up and they said no. And they took back the system. So take back the system.